next weeks, I will also release my second sustainability model. It's for supply chain management. It's a very big model, but it's also very complex. I will not demo this today, but perhaps in some weeks, I will also release this in the tech zone for the public download, and can handle everything across the supply chain. So a bill of materials, you have footprint database, you have some supply chain processes, you have assignment of ownership, factories, supermarkets, and so on. And finally, you have your supply chain reporting, including all simulation and planning purposes concerning different footprint, concerning costs, and so on. So perhaps it will be in the next weeks, it will be my next release. But let's now focus on the Scope 3 model. So Scope 3 means this is now sustainability that is very important for the procurement department in a company. So Scope 3 is the emission part that you can't, that you can only have when you have the decisions in your procurement department. So that means you can decide as procurement manager, shall I focus more on the spend part, on the cost-saving part, or shall I buy my materials with a more sustainability priority? It's a big company with several 100,000 employees. They are in the facility management, and they have to buy a lot of materials. And this is now the background of the whole model. So it's out of the industry. It's a real model. And this is now the possible landing page. And as you know, Planning Analytics Workspace is able to present all the figures in a very nice way. So this is a possible landing page. And of course, you can customize it. And you already see here on the landing page, you can drill down to your most important KPIs. For example, you can display your past emissions from the past, from the last 3 years, for example, but you all can also see what is my planning perspectives for the next year, for example, for the emissions part, and so on. So this is only visualizations, but let's go now to the real model. The real model is handling, as I said, 3 products. You see here the products, you see the history of the products. So currently now we are in the year 2022, and we have a history of 3 years on a monthly basis. And my first KPI that I'm handling is the demand in units. So for example, I know from the history, this was my consumption, for example, of bags and bottles and pallets. And always to help or to support a procurement manager, it's very easy for a procurement manager if he or she does not know the demand for the future. In the first step, I use, of course, the out-of-the-box AI forecast. I can directly click on it, and then the model is deciding in the background what is the perfect model for the forecast. And of course, I can check all underlying figures to check what is the underlying statistical main KPIs. And I also know, of course, which is the model that was chosen. So, and if I'm happy as an end user or procurement manager, I can forecast all my demand data for the future. And of course, I can adjust everything on a manual basis. For example, if I know already in advance there will be a big line in this month, I can adjust all my data. And of course, I can in total use all spreading functionalities that are available out of the box. As next KPI in my model, I handle the total procurement budget. So this is now the budget that I'm able to spend in the next year, and I've already pre-filled it, but of course it's possible now to also manually adjust my budget for next year, and this will be my second constraint in my model. The last constraint is concerning sustainability. So it's now the defined emission ceiling. So this is the maximum amount, for example, of CO2 emission that I'm allowed now for next year for the planning purposes. And of course, you can also plan this. You can plan this on an aggregated level for the whole company, or of course, you can break it down to some products you will buy, and you can also define here the maximum of amount of CO2 emissions. When I change the data, of course, I use here some nice graphical visualizations. I can drill down, I can drill up. So this is my product or material dimension. I have here my different years. I can slice, filter down on the different years. And as an end user, I will see in real time, of course, all my data. So now the first part is finished. I know what are my constraints for next year. In the second step, and this is now called footprint or supplier database, this is now the information that is available for me. And concerning footprints, this is now the information that was sent by the supplier to me, or the information that I have in my own data warehouse. So I have here now two KPIs. The first KPI is now my footprint, for example, a CO2 footprint. And I know I have now 3 suppliers. I have one product, for example, the BEX product. And I know now if I buy at this supplier here, my material, my bag, I will have a footprint of 4.5 kilogram per 1 unit if I buy this product at this supplier. And I have a second supplier, this one here, and he's more sustainable. He has less footprint. And of course, if I decide now to be more sustainable, I should buy my materials there. My second footprint is now the cost footprint. So this is now the more cost part of my model. And you see here, for example, this is now the price per unit if I buy my material at this supplier. And this would now be the price if I buy the same material at another supplier. And by the help of this, I have here a lot of supplier information. And of course, we can load this by the help of a data warehouse or by the supplier itself, or of course, by a third-party provider who can provide me this kind of information. As a second information or as a second parameter in my model, I handle now in general ESG rating that could be available. So the first thing here is product related. The second thing is in general overview about the supplier. And for example, I have here the first supplier, and the supplier is very sustainable. And perhaps the second supplier is not so good sustainable. For example, there's some children working in some countries, or the supplier is selling some arms or weapons or something else. So the general ESG rating can also be loaded from third-party suppliers, and it could be also one of a lot of other parameters in our model. And it's very important we can handle it. And now let's go to the forecasting or planning part of the Scope 3 model. So as we planned, we have some demand. And for example, now we are in the year 2022. I want to manually plan in the first step my bags. And now I have to decide what is my best supplier. And for example, now 2 suppliers are available. The third supplier was not able to provide me some cost information or some footprint information. So, and because of this, I cannot buy anything at this supplier. And I see here in this line now the demand that I need, for example, for my bags. Now I can start manual planning with a lot of manual effort. And for example, in the first step, I can decide I want to buy at the first supplier. And what the model is doing now in the background, it's calculating in real time what is now the outcome of this. So we have now a cost outcome. So this is now my spend data that is now calculated in my driver model. And in the second step, of course, we also have now a footprint that will be in the future, because if I buy the material at this supplier, I have a special footprint. Of course, another possibility could be I switch the supplier and do not go to this supplier and buy everything here, but I buy everything here. And now we have a complete other outcome. And now you see it becomes now very, very complex in the background, because we have a lot of combinations, we have a lot of materials, a lot of possibilities, and we will never hit the optimum. And now the question is, what is now the optimum? So let's fill now the data for the second part of the year. And now this could be one of my scenarios. But now let's go to the optimization part, and I switch now to the scenario model page. In the background, I've now created 4 different scenarios, but of course we can handle unlimited scenarios. But by the help of iLog-Cplex, we can now automatically calculate these scenarios. And by the help of a TI process, I can hit this process. We can now configure the iLog-Cplex. And for example, in the first step, I can calculate now, for example, the name of the scenario could be cost optimized. And I want to push it on my scenario 1, for example. And now I can say, what is now my weighting, my priority to be sustainable? So, for example, and if it's cost optimized, I'm not so sustainable. And for example, my priority would be 95% should be cost optimized and only 5% should be sustainable. Another constraint could be, is it allowed to overrun, for example, the CO2 budget or the cost budget? So I can now here configure everything. And if I push now the run button, the iLog-Cplex is running in the background and is calculating the model. And now we exactly see here now the result of the model. So who has run the model? What are my inputs for the model? And now you directly see here the input or the outcome. And for example, if I decide for this scenario, this would be my costs in money, and this would be my footprint. And for example, now I can also check another scenario, for example, sustainability optimized. And now I push it on the second scenario, for example, and I say now sustainability is very, very important for me, 85% priority. The system is running again and is now pushing and loading exactly the result to here. And of course, now it's possible to again check everything on a very granular level. So for example, I can go back. Now I can check, for example, the model has chosen for me now in the first model, cost optimized. I should take this supplier here and buy everything from this supplier if it's specs. And if I switch now to the second scenario, you see the Cplex algorithm has chosen another supplier. And latest now, by help of this iLog-Cplex mechanism, you can now calculate unlimited scenarios. For example, you can also drive a mix here. And then you see here on the right side, these are now possible scenarios, and you see it on the axes, footprint or emissions versus cost. And now you can define your strategy for the future. You can discuss, for example, the procurement officer can discuss with the sustainability officer, which will be now the strategy for next year. And yeah, you can calculate now nearly in real time if you have a new idea. And also if you have another constraints, for example, if there is a constraint that I have to buy minimum with a value of $5 million, for example, at the first supplier, you can also take these considerations into your strategy. And I think it's very nice for a procurement department, but also for a sustainability department. Finally, of course, you can export everything to another database, to the ERP system, if you want to take also the order data into your ERP system. And finally, if you have a very short-term idea, of course, it's also possible always to use the sandbox functionality. So if you have your basic scenario, your public basic scenario, you always can create, for example, a new private scenario, for example, best case. Then you can take you can have a call with your supplier and ask, so what would happen, dear Mr. Supplier, if you change the price of the units costs, for example, from 60 cents to 20 cents, what would happen? And then you see, of course, also in the sandbox and through the whole model, what will be the outcome if the supplier could change the price or if the supplier could reduce the footprint and so on. So it's also possible now in this chapter of the book that you can compare different sandboxes. And I think, yeah, finally, it's a nice accelerator to place planning analytics in the procurement department, but also in the sustainability department of clients, of existing clients, but also for new clients.